All right, what's up, macro? We're going to talk a little bit about borrowing and lending here. We're going to introduce a new graph called the loanable funds graph, which is going to focus on real interest rates and the supply and demand of loans. Okay, this is an important thing when we're looking at how much people are borrowing and how available borrowing is. And we'll look at a graph here. So to just kind of set this up, assume that the nominal interest rate is 5% and the inflation rate is 2%. What's going to be the real interest rate? Well, it's going to be 3%, right? The 5 minus 2 is going to be 3. But what's going to happen to the real interest rate if the inflation rate increases to 4? Well, now we went from 3 to 1, all right? And so what we end up finding out is that borrowers and lenders are going to focus on real interest rates since it represents the real return that they're going to get, okay? So the loanable funds market will do that. So is a real interest rate of 50% good or bad? Well, it depends, right? Bad for borrowers, but good for lenders. And so the loanable funds market shows supply and demand of loans and shows the equilibrium rate, real interest rate in that. Okay, so demand is the inverse relationship between real interest rate and the quantity of loans demanded. Okay, the demand is going to represent borrowers, right? And so borrowers, if they have a lower interest rate, want to borrow more. That's why it's inverse. Supply, that's going to represent savers or lenders, right? If the interest rates go down, they're going to want to supply less, right? They want higher interest rates, not lower. So it's not the same as the money market, okay? And so the supply is not going to be vertical. So you'll just have a supply and demand graph, okay? Just like aggregate supply, aggregate demand, or supply and demand. In this case, demand is borrowers or investors, and supply is going to be lenders and savers. Okay, notice the margins. It's not nominal interest rate. That would be the money market graph. And the quantity is loans. All right, so we're trying to figure out what's the equilibrium interest rate, real interest rate, and what is our equilibrium quantity based on where the supply and demand will meet. Okay. So savings and supply, so just looking at just the supply side of this, savings is what makes lending possible. All right, so think about the banks need people to keep their money in the bank in order to loan those out. If everyone started to pull out their money from savings, then that's probably going to be less money that they're going to be able to loan out, right? So if people start to pull out savings, then supply will go down, all right? So private savings, there's 3 different types of savings that we see. Private savings is just households and what they decide to save, right? We talked about the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. This would be the people's savings. Public saving is just the amount the government has, and then your national savings is your public plus your private savings. All right, so those could increase or decrease, which would increase or decrease your supply. So change in public or private savings will shift the supply. All right, so if we're looking at the supply of loanable funds, and let's say the government increases deficit spending. All right, well, what that means is that they're going to cut into their savings. Okay, they're going to save less. And the government obviously has a lot of money, so that's going to impact the supply of loans. So if the government decided to increase deficit spending, that means that they're going to save less and spend more. That would mean less money that's being put away in banks, which would mean the supply would fall. Okay. We also call this crowding out. So you can see how interest rates go up. So people are going to probably spend less. So there's more Unit 5 stuff. So we'll talk about this again. Foreigners also impact the supply. So foreigners, they look for interest rates. So if they see high interest rates in a country, they're going to want to put their money in those banks. If they see lowest interest rates, they're going to want to take their money out of those banks and put them in other countries that have higher interest rates. So they lend to the supply as well. All right. Some people just get cash or they have, American currency, so they have to figure out something to do with it. And so a lot of times they'll just let it sit in a bank and gain interest. We call this inflow of currency or money. So the amount of money entering the country, and we're not talking even about goods and services. We're really just literally talking about money. So people taking their money and putting it in U.S. banks or putting it in other banks is a way to earn interest. So outflow is the amount of money leaving the country. So if interest rates go down, then that money is going to leave the country. And then a net capital inflow is the inflow minus the outflow. So a change in the net capital inflow will shift the supply of loanable funds. All right, so that's a supply shifter. So let's think about demand. So borrowing is what demand is. And two different types of borrowing. We have private investment, so just businesses and consumers taking out loans for different things. Governments always do deficit spending, so government spending is greater than tax revenue. So when the government keeps increasing their deficit, they're actually making borrowing difficult because they are taking a lot of those loans. So a change that affects borrowing will shift the demand of loanable funds. So investment tax credit would be an example of that. All right, so here are the shifters. Just kind of go through them quick. So make sure you write them down, but change in borrowing in consumers, change in borrowing by businesses, and change in borrowing by the government. The supply would be the change in savings. So by private behavior and public. And then the third one to remember is foreign investment, right? So how much money is coming into banks from out of the country. So demand for loans comes from borrowers, supply comes from lenders. All right. So what will happen to the demand and supply for loanable funds if there's political instability? Well, if you think about it, okay, both supply and demand are going to shift, and they're both going to decrease. All right. And the reason is because demand is going to decrease because consumers and businesses, they borrow and invest less during that time. And supply will decrease because foreigners will be like, I'm going to get my money out of there. So they take all their capital out of the banks. We call this a capital flight. All right. So those are what the shifts look like. We see that loans fall and real interest rates will be indeterminate. Okay. Here's a practice question. Here's a practice question. Here's an FRQ. Watch the Clifford video. Bye. Well, I'll show those practice things another time. So if you didn't do them, don't worry about it.